In the fog-choked dawn of January 18, 1943, near the Tunisian village of Roba, a column of British Churchill tanks crept forward through mud that clung to their tracks like wet concrete. The crews inside, men of the North Irish Horse and the 142nd Regiment Royal Armoured Corps, had been briefed on rumors. Intelligence had mentioned a new German heavy tank operating in North Africa, something bigger than the Panzer IV. Something that had gutted a Free French unit near Pont-du-Fas without sustaining a single penetrating hit. The reports were fragmented, unverified, treated by some staff officers as the usual exaggeration that follows any surprise encounter. But the tank commanders in those Churchills, veterans of the Western Desert who had learned to trust the weight of silence more than the noise of speculation, felt something different that morning. They felt the arithmetic shifting beneath them. The Tiger had arrived in theater 2 months earlier, shipped in crates to Tunis as part of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion. Its deployment was strategic theater, a calculated introduction of overwhelming kinetic force into a campaign where the Africa Corps was already bleeding logistics and morale. The German High Command understood the mathematical reality of North Africa by late 1942. They were fighting a war of subtraction. Every liter of fuel, every replacement track link, every shell had to cross the Mediterranean under Allied air and naval interdiction. The Tiger was not sent to win the campaign, it was sent to impose cost, to create a psychological tax on Allied armor crews that would slow their operational tempo and buy time for Axis forces to consolidate a defensive perimeter. What the Germans did not fully anticipate was the nature of that psychological tax, not fear alone, but a sudden and brutal recalibration of every assumption British tank crews had carried into battle since 1940. The first engagement reports filed after Roba were clinical in their language, but unmistakable in their subtext. A Churchill tank commander, whose name remains redacted in the archived after-action summaries, described the moment his gunner scored what should have been a killing shot at 800 yards. The 2-pounder gun, a high-velocity weapon that had performed adequately against earlier Panzer models, sent its solid shot directly into the frontal hull of the approaching Tiger. The British crew watched through their optics as the tracer struck home. They waited for the secondary explosion, the telltale smoke, the halt in forward momentum that signaled a mobility kill. Instead, the Tiger continued advancing. No visible damage, no deviation in course. The German tank's turret rotated with hydraulic precision, and the return fire came in the form of an 88mm shell that struck the Churchill's turret ring and turned the interior into a pressure wave of fragmented steel and ignited propellant. The surviving crew members, those who managed to bail out through hatches jammed by the impact shock, reported later that the sound of the Tiger's gun was different, not louder necessarily, but deeper, a bass note that carried through the ground itself. This was the delayed realization, the moment when tactical doctrine collided with ballistic reality and shattered into irrelevance. British tank crews in North Africa had developed a working model of armored combat based on 3 years of engagement data. They understood the effective range of the German 75mm gun. They knew the frontal armor values of the Panzer III and IV. They had internalized the dance of maneuver warfare in desert terrain, how to use terrain masking, how to exploit the superior optics of British tanks for first-shot advantage, how to coordinate with infantry and artillery to isolate and destroy enemy armor in detail. The Tiger invalidated all of it in a single encounter. Its frontal armor, 100mm of face-hardened steel plate set at near vertical angles, was functionally immune to the British 2-pounder at any range beyond point blank. Its gun, the legendary 88mm KWK-36, could penetrate the frontal armor of a Churchill at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The effective engagement envelope, the space within which British tanks could fight and survive, had collapsed to zero. The crews understood this before their commanding officers did.
before the intelligence analysts could compile the data, before the war planners in London could convene committees to discuss countermeasures. They understood it in the way a man understands he is drowning, not through analysis, but through the immediate physical recognition that the rules governing his survival have changed. The radio transcripts from those early Tiger encounters, the ones that survived the war and were later declassified, contain a vocabulary of disbelief. Crews reporting that their shells were bouncing off like raindrops. Commanders requesting permission to disengage because we can't hurt him, but he's killing us from outside our range. One transcript, recorded during an engagement near Medjez El Bab in late January, captures a gunner's voice, calm, almost curious, asking his commander, "What exactly are we supposed to do about that?" The question hung in the static-filled silence that followed, unanswered, because there was no answer. Not yet. The Tiger was not an invention in the sense that it introduced novel technology. It was an invention in the sense that it combined existing technologies, the 88mm anti-aircraft gun, the torsion bar suspension system developed for earlier Panzer models, the interleaved road wheel arrangement that distributed weight and improved cross-country mobility, into a configuration that represented a qualitative leap in armored warfare. The German engineers at Henschel had been tasked with creating a breakthrough tank, a vehicle capable of engaging and destroying enemy armor at extreme range while remaining invulnerable to return fire. They succeeded by abandoning the constraints that had governed Allied tank design. British and American tanks were designed around logistical realities, the width of European roads, the weight limits of standard bridges, the cargo capacity of Liberty ships. The Tiger was designed around a single operational requirement: kill everything you see before it can kill you. The result was a 56-ton monster that consumed fuel at a catastrophic rate, required specialized transport and maintenance infrastructure, and could barely fit through the rail tunnels of Western Europe. But on the battlefield, in that narrow window of engagement where mechanical performance mattered more than strategic sustainability, it was untouchable.
The industrial math behind the Tiger reveals the strategic calculation at the heart of its deployment. Germany produced approximately 1,347 Tiger I tanks during the entire war. By contrast, the United States produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks. The Soviet Union produced more than 57,000 T-34s. The Tiger was never intended to win through numbers. It was intended to win through exchange ratio, to destroy 10, 15, 20 Allied tanks for every Tiger lost, and in doing so, impose a psychological and material cost that would slow the Allied advance and complicate their operational planning. The doctrine was sound. A single Tiger, properly positioned and supported, could dominate a sector of front and force Allied commanders to commit disproportionate resources, artillery, air support, infantry assaults, to neutralize it. The problem, from the German perspective, was that the doctrine assumed a static or semi-mobile defensive war. It assumed terrain where the Tiger's advantages, its gun range, its armor protection, could be maximized. In the fluid mechanized warfare of North Africa, and later in the hedgerows of Normandy and the open plains of Eastern Europe, those assumptions proved brittle. But in January 1943, in the hill country south of Tunis, none of that mattered to the British crews encountering the Tiger for the first time. They were not thinking about production statistics or strategic sustainability. They were thinking about survival, about how to explain to their mates over tea that night, if they lived that long, what it felt like to shoot a tank and watch the shell ricochet harmlessly into the dirt, about how the training manuals and the tactical briefings had prepared them for everything except this, the cold, mechanical reality of being outclassed. One tank commander, interviewed years after the war for an oral history project, described the experience in terms that captured the forensic horror of it. It was like showing up to a knife fight and discovering the other bloke had brought a rifle, and he was standing on a hill, and you were in a ditch. The British response to the Tiger was not immediate panic, but rather a kind of methodical dread. The recognition among fighting units that every tactical manual would need rewriting, every engagement plan recalculated against a new baseline of lethality. By February 1943, as more Tiger encounters accumulated in the operational logs of British armored regiments, a pattern emerged in the after-action reports. Crews were developing ad hoc countermeasures born not from doctrine, but from desperation. They learned to call in artillery fire the moment a Tiger was spotted, not to destroy it. The probability of a direct hit from field guns was negligible against a moving target, but to create smoke and dust that would obscure the German gunners' sight lines long enough for British tanks to withdraw. They learned to never, under any circumstances, engage a Tiger frontally. The only viable tactic was flanking maneuvers, executed at ranges close enough to negate the Tiger's optical advantage, ideally under 300 meters, where a shot into the thinner side armor might achieve penetration. But closing to 300 meters against a tank that could kill you at 2,000 meters required either extraordinary tactical coordination or extraordinary luck, and in the chaos of North African combat, both were rare commodities. The crews also learned to listen. The Tiger's Maybach HL-230 engine, a 12-cylinder gasoline power plant producing 700 horsepower, had a distinctive acoustic signature, a deep, thrumming rumble that carried across open terrain. Experienced British tank commanders trained themselves to recognize that sound, to differentiate it from the higher-pitched whine of Panzer III and IV engines. Hearing a Tiger before seeing it provided perhaps 30 seconds of tactical warning, enough time to button up, alert the squadron, and begin evasive maneuvers. This auditory early warning system became so critical that some units included it in their standard operating procedures, instructing drivers to cut engines periodically during advances so commanders could listen for enemy armor. The battlefield, in this sense, became a space of acoustic intelligence, where survival depended as much on the interpretation of mechanical noise as on visual acquisition of targets. The psychological impact of the Tiger extended beyond individual engagements. It infected planning at the regimental and brigade level. British armor commanders in Tunisia began to exhibit what operational analysts would later term Tiger fixation, an overcautious approach to offensive operations driven by the possibility, however remote, of encountering the German heavy tank. Attacks that might have proceeded with aggressive momentum were instead staged with elaborate preparatory artillery barrages and reconnaissance in force, all designed to flush out any Tigers before committing the main armored thrust. This caution was rational from a force preservation standpoint. A single Tiger could abort an entire offensive if it caught British tanks in the open during their approach. But caution carried its own cost. It slowed operational tempo. It allowed German forces to consolidate defensive positions. It transformed the Tiger from a tactical weapon into a strategic one, its mere potential presence altering Allied behavior across entire sectors of front. The industrial audit of the Tiger reveals a machine built with ruthless precision and equally ruthless disregard for logistical sustainability. The tank's transmission, a Maybach Alvar model adapted from existing designs, was mechanically sophisticated but fragile under combat loads. The interleaved road wheel system, which provided excellent weight distribution and cross-country mobility, became a maintenance nightmare in the muddy terrain of Tunisia and later in the Russian winter, where packed dirt and ice would freeze between the wheels and immobilize the tank until crews could chip it free with hand tools. The Tiger consumed fuel at a rate of roughly 200 liters per 100 kilometers under combat conditions, an appetite that strained even Germany's carefully husbanded fuel reserves. Crews were instructed to shut down engines whenever possible to conserve fuel, a practice that left Tigers vulnerable during the vulnerable minutes required to restart and warm the engine before combat readiness could be achieved. Yet, despite these mechanical vulnerabilities, the Tiger's core performance remained devastating. The 88mm gun was a marvel of ballistic engineering. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the Flak 1836, it had been adapted for tank use with minimal modification. The result was a weapon with extraordinary muzzle velocity, approximately 1,000 meters per second, and corresponding armor penetration values that exceeded anything fielded by Allied tanks in 1943. At 1,000 meters, the standard Panzer Granat 39 armor-piercing round could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor plate set at 30 degrees from vertical. For comparison, the Churchill's maximum frontal armor was 102 millimeters, and that was only on the turret mantlet. Most of the hull was far thinner. The Sherman, which would become the primary Allied medium tank by mid-1943, had frontal hull armor of just 51 millimeters. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Tiger could engage Allied tanks at ranges where return fire was physically impossible, creating what amounted to a free fire zone extending outward from the Tiger's position in all directions. British tank crews processed this information not through formal briefings, but through the grim pedagogy of survival. The men who lived through Tiger encounters became informal teachers, passing along hard-won knowledge in the minutes before battle or during the long watches of night lagger. They taught the new replacements to watch for the muzzle brake, the distinctive cylindrical device at the end of the 88's barrel that reduced recoil and was visible even at extreme range through binoculars. They taught them to look for the commander's cupola, which protruded higher on the Tiger than on other German tanks and could sometimes be spotted before the hull was visible. They taught them the angles, that the Tiger's side armor, while still formidable at 80 millimeters, was vulnerable to the British 6-pounder gun if the shot could be placed perpendicular to the plate at close range. And they taught them the unspoken rule that governed all Tiger encounters. If you cannot flank it, if you cannot get artillery on it, if you cannot call in air support, run. There was no shame in withdrawal. The only shame was dying uselessly against an enemy you could not hurt. The village fighting in Tunisia introduced a new variable into the Tiger calculus. In open desert, the German tanks' advantages were maximized: long sight lines, firm ground for stable gunnery, room to maneuver and exploit superior range. But in the narrow streets and rubble-choked squares of places like Tabourba and Mejez el-Bab, the engagement ranges collapsed. British tanks could use buildings for cover, advance under concealment, and emerge at ranges where even the 2-pounder had a fighting chance against side armor. The Tigers, despite their overwhelming firepower, became constrained by their own mass. A 56-ton tank could not easily reverse in a medieval street barely wide enough for its tracks. Crews became vulnerable to close assault by infantry armed with sticky bombs and Molotov cocktails, crude weapons that could not penetrate armor but could disable optics, jam turret rings, or start engine fires if applied with suicidal determination. The British learned to weaponize terrain. They learned to funnel Tigers into killing zones where the German tanks' advantages became liabilities. Anti-tank guns, the 6-pounder and later the 17-pounder, would be emplaced in concealed positions overlooking choke points, pre-registered for range and deflection. When a Tiger entered the kill zone, multiple guns would fire simultaneously, aiming for track links, drive sprockets, and road wheels. A mobility kill was as good as a destruction in urban terrain. The result was a weapon with extraordinary muzzle velocity, approximately 1,000 meters per second, and corresponding armor penetration values that exceeded anything fielded by Allied tanks in 1943. At 1,000 meters, the standard Panzer Granat 39 armor-piercing round could penetrate 120 millimeters of armor plate set at 30 degrees from vertical. For comparison, the Churchill's maximum frontal armor was 102 millimeters, and that was only on the turret madlet. Most of the hull was far thinner. The Sherman, which would become the primary Allied medium tank by mid-1943, had frontal hull armor of just 51 millimeters. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Tiger could engage Allied tanks at ranges where return fire was physically impossible, creating what amounted to a free fire zone extending outward from the Tiger's position in all directions. British tank crews processed this information not through formal briefings, but through the grim pedagogy of survival. The men who lived through Tiger encounters became informal teachers, passing along hard-won knowledge in the minutes before battle or during the long watches of night logger. They taught the new replacements to watch for the muzzle brake, the distinctive cylindrical device at the end of the 88's barrel that reduced recoil and was visible even at extreme range through binoculars. They taught them to look for the commander's cupola, which protruded higher on the Tiger than on other German tanks and could sometimes be spotted before the hull was visible. They taught them the angles, that the Tiger's side armor, while still formidable at 80 millimeters, was vulnerable to the British 6-pounder gun if the shot could be placed perpendicular to the plate at close range. And they taught them the unspoken rule that governed all Tiger encounters: if you cannot flank it, if you cannot get artillery on it, if you cannot call in air support, run. There was no shame in withdrawal. The only shame was dying uselessly against an enemy you could not hurt. The village fighting in Tunisia introduced a new variable into the Tiger calculus. In open desert, the German tank's advantages were maximized: long sight lines, firm ground for stable gunnery, room to maneuver and exploit superior range. But in the narrow streets and rubble-choked squares of places like Tiborba and Medjez el-Bab, the engagement ranges collapsed. British tanks could use buildings for cover, advance under concealment, and emerge at ranges where even the 2-pounder had a fighting chance against side armor. The Tigers, despite their overwhelming firepower, became constrained by their own mass. A 56-ton tank could not easily reverse in a medieval street barely wide enough for its tracks. Crews became vulnerable to close assault by infantry armed with sticky bombs and Molotov cocktails, crude weapons that could not penetrate armor but could disable optics, jam turret rings, or start engine fires if applied with suicidal determination. The British learned to weaponize terrain. They learned to funnel Tigers into killing zones where the German tank's advantages became liabilities. Anti-tank guns, the 6-pounder and later the 17-pounder, would be emplaced in concealed positions overlooking choke points, pre-registered for range and deflection. When a Tiger entered the kill zone, multiple guns would fire simultaneously, aiming for track links, drive sprockets, and road wheels. A mobility kill was as good as a destruction in urban terrain.
A Tiger that could not move was a Tiger that could be bypassed, isolated, and eventually destroyed by engineers with demolition charges once darkness fell. These tactics worked, but they required patience, coordination, and a willingness to cede ground temporarily, to let the Tiger advance into the trap rather than contesting every meter of approach. The human cost of these lessons was tallied in burned-out Churchills and Shermans, in Graves' registration forms, in the clinical language of casualty reports that listed men as killed in action without elaborating on the manner of their death. Tank crews understood that their survival depended less on armor protection than on tactical cunning and pure chance. They understood that the difference between going home and dying in a metal box often came down to whether the Tiger's first shot struck the turret or the hull, whether the German gunner was veteran or replacement, whether your own driver could execute a reverse turn under fire without throwing a track. These were variables beyond training or courage. They were the kinetic reality of industrialized warfare, where human agency narrowed to a sliver of possibility between mechanical forces too large to resist. By March 1943, British intelligence had compiled enough data on the Tiger to produce technical bulletins distributed to armored units. These documents, marked secret and printed on the thin onion skin paper used for field distribution, contained detailed diagrams showing the Tiger's armor layout, weak points, and estimated penetration values for various British weapons at various ranges. The bulletins were factual, almost detached in tone, but they could not disguise the essential truth that frontline crews already knew. There was no reliable way to kill a Tiger with existing British tank guns except through exceptional circumstances or desperate close-range attacks. The solution, when it came, was not a tactical refinement, but an industrial response, the kind of brute force engineering pivot that characterized Allied warfare strategy throughout 1943 and beyond. The British 17-pounder anti-tank gun, already in development before the first Tiger encounter, was accelerated through testing and rushed into production. This was not a subtle weapon. The 17-pounder fired a 76mm projectile at muzzle velocities approaching 900 meters per second, generating kinetic energy sufficient to penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at ranges beyond 1,000 meters. But the gun was heavy, weighing over 2 tons in its towed configuration, and mounting it in a tank turret required substantial redesign of existing platforms. The initial solution was improvisation. The 17-pounder was fitted to the American-supplied M4 Sherman chassis, creating the hybrid vehicle that British crews would nickname the Firefly. The first Fireflies would not reach combat units until early 1944, meaning that throughout the entirety of the Tunisian campaign and into the Italian operations, British tank crews faced the Tiger with weapons they knew were inadequate.
This knowledge created a peculiar combat psychology. The crews were not demoralized into paralysis. British armored regiments continued to execute their assigned missions with professional competence, but they operated under a constant awareness of asymmetry. Every advance was planned with the assumption that a Tiger might be waiting in hull-down position beyond the next ridgeline. Every engagement began with the question of whether enemy armor was present, and if so, what type. The identification drill became critical. Crews learned to distinguish the Tiger's silhouette from the similar-looking Panzer IV at extreme range, to recognize the specific geometry of the turret, the positioning of the cupola, the width of the tracks. Misidentification could be fatal. Engaging a Panzer IV with appropriate aggression when it was actually a Tiger meant closing to ranges where the German gun could not miss. The German crews, for their part, understood the psychological advantage they wielded. Tiger commanders were trained to exploit the fear their presence generated. They would deliberately expose their tanks at maximum range to draw Allied fire, demonstrating invulnerability and forcing enemy armor to reveal their positions before closing to lethal range. The Tiger's commander's cupola provided exceptional all-around visibility, allowing the German crew to observe the battlefield with near-panoramic awareness. This visibility advantage, combined with superior optics, Zeiss range-finding equipment calibrated for extreme-range gunnery, meant that Tigers could effectively control vast sectors of terrain simply through positioning. A single Tiger placed on commanding ground could interdict an entire axis of advance, forcing Allied units to choose between costly frontal assault or time-consuming flanking maneuvers that might take hours or days to execute. The Battle of Hunt's Gap in late February 1943 illustrated the operational problem the Tiger represented. A British armored brigade, advancing to relieve pressure on American forces engaged with Rommel's offensive at Kasserine Pass, encountered 3 Tigers positioned on a ridgeline overlooking the only viable approach route. The Tigers opened fire at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, systematically destroying the lead elements of the British column. 11 tanks knocked out in the first 20 minutes of engagement. British attempts to suppress the Tigers with artillery fire proved ineffective. The German tanks simply reversed down the reverse slope of the ridge when shelling began, then returned to firing positions once the barrage lifted. The standoff lasted 6 hours, during which the British brigade was effectively paralyzed. Eventually, a flanking force of Crusader light tanks managed to work around the Tiger position using a waddy system that provided concealment, forcing the German tanks to withdraw before they could be engaged from the side. But the damage was done. The relief operation was delayed by a full day, and the psychological impact on the British crews was profound. They had been stopped cold by 3 tanks.
The industrial mathematics underlying this engagement revealed the strategic calculation that justified the Tiger's enormous cost. Each Tiger represented approximately 300,000 Reichsmarks to produce, roughly twice the cost of a Panzer IV. The specialized manufacturing, the precision machining required for the interleaved suspension, the heat treating of armor plate, the assembly of the complex transmission system consumed production capacity that might have produced 2 or 3 medium tanks instead.
But if each Tiger could achieve a kill ratio of 10 to 1, if each Tiger could delay enemy operations and force the commitment of disproportionate resources to counter it, then the investment was strategically sound. Germany was fighting a war of attrition it could not win through industrial output alone. The Tiger was an attempt to change the attrition calculus, to make each German tank worth multiple enemy vehicles, thereby offsetting the vast numerical superiority the Allies could bring to bear. British crews understood this calculation at an intuitive level, even if they lacked access to production statistics or strategic assessments. They understood that they were part of a numbers game, that their role was to trade British and American tanks for German ones at rates that eventually, inevitably, would exhaust the German capacity to replace losses. But understanding the strategic logic did nothing to diminish the immediate, visceral reality of being outgunned. The man sitting in a Churchill turret, watching an 88mm round arc toward him at supersonic velocity, was not consoled by the knowledge that his tank was cheaper to produce than his opponent's. He was focused on the split-second decision tree that might keep him alive, whether to traverse left or right, whether the driver could execute an emergency reverse, whether bailing out would expose him to machine gun fire from German infantry inevitably accompanying the Tiger. The terrain of Tunisia imposed its own logic on Tiger employment. The hills and wadis, the narrow valleys and ridgeline positions created natural choke points where a few well-positioned tanks could dominate. The Germans exploited this terrain brilliantly, positioning Tigers to cover the limited number of viable approach routes available to Allied forces. But the same terrain that magnified the Tiger's defensive advantages also constrained its mobility. The tank's weight made it vulnerable to soft ground. Several Tigers were lost not to enemy action, but to mechanical breakdown or bogging down in mud that lighter vehicles could traverse. The limited number of bridges capable of supporting 56 tons meant that Tigers were often restricted to specific routes, making their general locations predictable even if their exact positions remained unknown until contact. British intelligence officers began compiling Tiger sighting reports, creating a running plot of known and suspected locations. This intelligence was disseminated daily to combat units, providing at least some advance warning of where the German heavy tanks might be encountered. The reports contained details that seem almost mundane in their specificity. The serial numbers visible on Tigers photographed by reconnaissance aircraft, the tactical markings that identified individual tanks, the names of known Tiger commanders identified through radio intercepts and prisoner interrogation. This granular intelligence gathering was an attempt to impose predictability on an unpredictable threat, to create the illusion of control through information, even when tactical options remained severely limited.
The crews developed their own intelligence network, informal but effective. Tank commanders would share information during nightly briefings, passing along details about where Tigers had been spotted, what tactics had worked or failed, which routes seemed safer than others. This knowledge transfer was critical because crew turnover was high. Tanks that encountered Tigers rarely survived the encounter with their full crew intact. Replacements arrived from training units in Britain with theoretical knowledge of German armor, but no practical understanding of what it meant to face a Tiger in combat. The veterans tried to prepare them, tried to compress months of battlefield learning into a few hours of hurried instruction, but some lessons could only be learned through experience. The first time a new crew saw their rounds bounce harmlessly off a Tiger's glacis plate, the first time they felt the concussive impact of an 88mm shell striking nearby, those were lessons that could not be taught, only survived. By April 1943, as the Tunisian campaign approached its conclusion, British armored regiments had developed a working doctrine for Tiger encounters. The doctrine was not elegant. It acknowledged the fundamental reality that British tanks could not reliably defeat Tigers in direct combat. Instead, it emphasized avoidance, suppression, and combined arms coordination. When Tigers were encountered, the doctrine called for immediate artillery support, smoke deployment to obscure German sightlines, and either withdrawal or flanking maneuvers depending on the tactical situation. Infantry would be called forward to assault Tiger positions with anti-tank weapons at close range. Air support would be requested, though with the understanding that hitting a moving tank from the air was extraordinarily difficult, even under ideal conditions. The doctrine was essentially defensive in nature, designed to neutralize the Tiger threat rather than destroy it outright. This defensive doctrine reflected a broader truth about Allied armored warfare in 1943. The Americans and British had chosen to prioritize reliability, ease of manufacture, and logistical sustainability over maximum individual tank performance. The Sherman, which would become the workhorse of Allied armored forces, was never intended to fight Tigers on equal terms. It was intended to be produced in overwhelming numbers, to be mechanically reliable enough to cover vast distances without breaking down, to be simple enough that minimally trained crews could operate it effectively. The strategic assumption was that numerical superiority and operational mobility would ultimately overcome German qualitative advantages. This assumption would prove correct, but it offered cold comfort to the crews who had to implement the strategy at ground level, who had to accept that their survival depended not on having the best tank, but on being part of an industrial system that could absorb losses and continue functioning.